Good morning to you all. Last day, last session, but as my mentor Selçuk mentioned, beautiful presentations will be held today in parallel sessions. I wish I could have had the chance to listen to some of the authors in the other halls. Selçuk abi, I think, introduced us very beautifully. For many, many years, many, many researchers had realized these things, and now today we are realizing and seeing the same things. I believe frontal lobes are at the core of many psychiatric symptoms and psychiatric disorders. When I was interested with psychosis and schizophrenia, when I became interested in psychosis and schizophrenia, began to work with the frontal lobe and the frontal lobe functions. I will try to talk about frontal lobe and the frontal lobe functions. As you have seen, three major function areas are involved with the frontal lobe functions. The first part will contain general information about frontal lobe, and in the second part I will try to talk about working memory and language. A general view. I believe everybody knows this. These are the lobes to give you an idea. Let's spend a few minutes here. Premotor cortex, prefrontal cortex. I will focus on prefrontal association areas and the prefrontal cortex. Basically, are involved with voluntary behavior, decision-making, personality, thinking capabilities, very humane, very human qualities lie here. Language, smell, limbic areas, very important in terms of emotions and learning. Of course, premotor and motor areas, the frontal side, the frontal areas of the central sulcus are very important. This is again a general view. The lateralization, and you see the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere dominances. Most importantly for us, language formation. I believe my pointer is not working. Luckily, I have my own pointer with me. Memory, language, visual, spatial abilities. You see the lateralization of these. The frontal lobes have been shown with blue in 4 aspects. Frontal lobes are the largest among the brain lobes. They form 1/3 of every hemisphere. There are 3 major areas in each lobe: dorsolateral, medial, and orbitofrontal. I will repeat these further in the coming slides. Frontal lobes form 20% of the entire cortex. As you can see, there are motor, premotor, and prefrontal areas. Prefrontal areas will be the area that I will focus on. The limbic area is important in terms of emotion formation, and therefore limbic areas are related with the frontal areas. Premotor, motor, dorsolateral, and orbital. This is prefrontal area. Again, in more detail, especially in cognitive functions. The prefrontal area, this area of prefrontal area is involved. Emotions, this part of limbic area is involved with emotions. What about in functional terms? Motor cortex have 5 sub-areas. You see them here. Prefrontal cortex has 3 areas: dorsolateral, medial, and orbitofrontal parts. And there are 5 frontal subcortical networks. All of these networks have input into they have all input from dorsal rapheus and central medial brain tegmentum, especially lateral area, temporal orbitofrontal area, and amygdala, and anterior cingulate, and hippocampus, and entorhinal are the areas of data source. These are frontal subcortical networks. They start from the frontal cortex, go into striatum, go into basal ganglia, and then towards thalamus. Dorsal medial prefrontal cortex have connections in temporal, parietal, thalamus, globus, and pallidus. They get data from these areas. Basic functions are motivation and starting the activity, starting the activities. What happens in the lesions? If there's a lesion in the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, there's apatheia, lack of drive, lack of insight, spontaneous behavior, goes all over to akinetic abulic syndromes. Most important for us, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is the most important area for us. It has connections from many places: motor, emotional, association areas, thalamus, globus pallidus, cauda, substantia nigra. Functional. What are its functions? Working memory and monitorization of behavior and modulation of behavior based on working memory. What happens when it has lesions? Lack of executive functions, loss of interest, emotional impulsivity, lack of attention towards the right stimulus. I want to talk about dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. These are the lateral frontopolar cortex. Frontal lobe functions, the fundamental functions. What are they? They are problem solving, spontaneity, memory, language, motivation, judgment, impulse control, social and sexual behavior are the functions of the frontal lobe. Problem solving. When we talk about problem solving, these are the classical problems: city A, city B. Cognitive functions are the most important functions of the prefrontal cortex. Intelligence, complex learning, and personality is also involved with prefrontal cortex. When there are lesions in this area, there are changes in mental capacity and personality. Emotions are the product of frontal cortex. In limbic system, there is a very important connection with the limbic system organizing the emotions. The emotional core of the self is the limbic system, and in connection with the prefrontal cortex modulates our emotions. Prefrontal cortex, the 3 areas of prefrontal cortex: dorsolateral area, responsible of executive cognitive functions, strategic planning, problem solving, and language communication. Orbital frontal cortex is responsible of social behavior. The medial part is responsible of starting the behavior in response to the environmental stimuli. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is responsible of the solutions to complex problems. It's independent from the environmental conditions. Attention allocation and attention continuation is conducted by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and also it is responsible of designing motor programs that guide the behavior. What are the executive functions? Executive functions make it possible for us to go on with our lives. being able to set goals, being able to follow certain paths to reach these goals, being able to plan, being able to conduct these plans effectively are all possible through the executive functions. Of course, we have to irade, will. We have to be able to take control of our will, planning. These are all parts of executive functions. We should be ready to face the problems along the way of reaching our goals. The executive functions, of course, employ many other brain functions like motivation, like memory, like attention. We should not forget the contribution of these other brain functions. Brain functions as a whole. We cannot really separate one area from the other in its completion. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. What happens when there's a problem with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex? Perseveration, memory deficiency, inadequacy of inhibiting impulses, impulsive behavior, inadequacy of modifying behavior. In psychiatric terms, it's known to cause depression. What about orbitofrontal cortex? What happens when there's a change in its functions? There are marked personality changes, increased sexuality, impulsivity. Medial anterior cingulate cortex, in its function loss, motivation loss, akinetic mutism. These are the negative syndromes, negative symptoms of schizophrenia, actually. I want to focus on memory. Memory's fundamental neuroanatomy. Cortical structures, hippocampus, association cortex, ventromedial and dorsolateral frontal areas, subcortical structures, basal ganglia, thalamus, and basal forebrain, prefrontal cortex, amygdala, basal forebrain, hippocampus are very important in terms of memory. I'm going to go through them in detail. Prefrontal cortex, amygdala, hippocampal formation, and thalamus. I want to emphasize in this slide the Brodmann areas. The areas involved with working memory are these areas, shown in blue. When we're talking about memory, there is executive memory and there is perceptual memory. Executive memory is directed by the four parts of the brain, whereas perceptual memory is directed by the hind parts of the brain. Executive memory directs our behavior. Perceptual memory gets input from the emotions and contributes to memory function. Working memory basically has a limited capacity and limited duration. It's a neural activation source. It is there for short-term memory. It has subsystems to it. The first of these subsystems is central executive. It's the major contributor. It's responsible of the executive processes, responsible of attention allocation, responsible of inhibiting unnecessary information, responsible of integrating information, and coordinates working memory systems. Another area, phonological loop, activates verbal information, audible verbal information. It actually allows us to memorize verbal information. It's something we always do. Somebody gives us a telephone number. Before we use a telephone number, it's very short time, but we repeat it over and over so that we do not forget the number. This is a function of the working memory, basically. Another subsystem is the visual spatial sketchpad, another area to keep the visual information active. And lastly, there's the episodic buffer, allowing these different parts to work in harmony. General view, input. After input there is sensory memory, then the attention is at play, central executive. The same thing, slightly differently. Sensory memory, sensory input, short-term memory or working memory. Can you please round up? Yes. Another area is attention. Selective attention and divided attention is very important. It has three different parts. Frontal areas and attention in terms of frontal areas. Frontal areas are responsible of voluntary attention. They get input from frontal lobe, the frontal areas, middle frontal lobe, those lateral frontal area. The attention networks. These areas work in harmony, activate the attention system. Lastly, language functions and frontal lobe. Phonology, semantics, syntax, and prosodia are basic functions. Frontal areas are important. The Broca area is important for syntax. Broca area is the area where we formulate language. When there's a lesion of the Broca area, the person knows what word to use, however, he cannot do that. Wernicke area, although it is in connection to the frontal areas, but it is closer to the limbic area. Auditory association area is involved with Wernicke. Person hears what is being talked, but does not understand what is being talked. In more detail, Broca area is responsible for the motor component. Wernicke area is responsible for the sensory component. Primary auditory area is also involved. These are the language areas in the brain, Broca, Wernicke, and the other parts. They work in harmony and thus give rise to language. This is my last slide. Effects of cortical lesions on language. The lesions that disturb language the most are the lesions at the area of Wernicke and limbic areas. In cases of frontal lesions, language might be affected in different ways. As you can see, all the areas of the brain, any part of the brain might have an effect on language. Lastly, frontal areas are critical, especially the prefrontal area is much more important. Working memory, attention, executive functions are very important functions. They are very important for us to conduct our daily life. Many psychiatric disorders and their symptoms are seen due to lesions of the